On a damp Wednesday evening in early April, the members of the Flaxborough Civic Improvement Committee gathered in the upstairs room of the Royal George public house, where the carpet smelt faintly of ale and civic responsibility. The meeting, like most meetings of that particular committee, had begun with admirable seriousness and drifted almost immediately into the comfortable rhythms of mild disagreement. Mr. Harold Bletchley, a retired draper who had appointed himself chairman with the calm inevitability of a man who owned a gavel, cleared his throat and tapped the table. "We must, if I may say so, keep our focus on the matter of the War Memorial flower beds," he said. "The begonias last year were quite disgraceful." Mrs. Ivy Cattermole, who chaired the Women's Institute Subcommittee for Floral Harmony and Seasonal Display, stiffened perceptibly. "The begonias were perfectly respectable begonias," she replied. "If anything was disgraceful, Mr. Bletchley, it was the watering schedule imposed by the council." Across the table, Councillor Percy Dodd allowed himself a patient smile. Percy Dodd possessed the air of a man who had survived 37 municipal meetings without once expressing a definite opinion. "Watering," he observed vaguely, "is always a delicate matter." At the far end of the table sat Mr. Leonard Crick, the town solicitor, a narrow gentleman with pale hair and the cautious expression of someone who had spent a lifetime discouraging other people from signing things. He had been silent for most of the meeting. This was not unusual. Solicitors in small towns had a professional instinct for silence. But on this particular evening he carried a leather document case which, to those with an eye for social drama, suggested a purpose beyond begonias. Mrs. Cattermole noticed it first. "You look as though you have something official there, Mr. Crick," she said. Crick gave a small, apologetic cough. "As a matter of fact, I do." The room became attentive in the polite, but immediate manner of people who sensed the arrival of something more interesting than flower beds. "It concerns," Crick continued carefully, "the late Mr. Ambrose Hardwick." The name produced a small rustle around the table. Ambrose Hardwick had lived for 42 years in a narrow Georgian house called Linden House on Market Lane. He had been a bachelor, a former shipping agent, and a man whose habits had inspired both curiosity and mild irritation. Most notably, he had died the previous Tuesday while attempting to argue with the postman about stamps. "Very sad business," said Councillor Dodd solemnly. "Yes," said Crick, "quite sudden." Mr. Bletchley folded his hands. "And the committee is concerned how?" Crick opened the leather case with professional care. "Well, Mr. Hardwick left a will." "That is normally the case," said Bletchley cautiously. Crick hesitated, then removed a folded document. "However, the terms of the will include a clause which directly involves the Civic Improvement Committee." Mrs. Cattermole leaned forward. "I knew Ambrose Hardwick had opinions about the town," she said. "He once wrote to the newspaper about my hanging baskets." Crick adjusted his spectacles. "The clause reads as follows." He unfolded the paper. "I leave the sum of £20,000 to the Flaxborough Civic Improvement Committee on the condition that the committee erects a permanent statue in my honour in the Market Square." The silence that followed was thoughtful rather than shocked. Mr. Bletchley spoke first. "A statue? Yes, in the Market Square? Indeed." Councillor Dodd considered this with municipal caution. That would be noticeable. Mrs. Cattermole frowned. "I don't recall Mr. Hardwick being particularly statue-worthy." Crick cleared his throat again. "There is a further condition." Everyone waited. "The statue must depict Mr. Hardwick seated upon a chair holding a letter addressed to the Flaxborough Chronicle, and beneath the statue must appear the inscription, 'A man who spoke the truth.'" There was another silence. This one contained several layers of discomfort. The reason was simple. Ambrose Hardwick had spent the last 20 years writing letters to the Flaxborough Chronicle, complaining about the behaviour, taste, and moral standards of almost everyone in town. Mrs. Cattermole spoke with careful restraint. He wrote that my chrysanthemums resembled boiled cabbages. Yes, said Crick quietly. Mr. Bletchley rubbed his chin. £20,000 is, of course, a considerable sum. It would improve the flower beds, said Councillor Dodd. But a statue of Ambrose Hardwick, Mrs. Cattermole said slowly, in the market square would invite comment. Crick nodded. There is also a final provision. He turned the page. If the committee refuses the statue, the money will pass to the Society for the Preservation of Unusual Marine Worms. The committee considered this. None of them had any opinion about marine worms. But the idea of losing £20,000 to them felt distinctly humiliating. Mr. Bletchley sighed. Well, the town has endured worse things than statues. Mrs. Cattermole folded her arms. I still say it will cause resentment. At that moment, the door of the committee room opened. A young barman leaned in. "Excuse me," he said. "Telephone call for Mr. Crick." Crick blinked. "For me?" "Yes, sir, from the police station." He rose and stepped into the corridor. The committee resumed a quiet discussion about marine worms and begonias. 5 minutes later, Crick returned. His expression had changed. Mr. Bletchley noticed immediately. "Something wrong?" Crick sat down slowly. "There has been a development." "What sort of development?" Crick folded the will again with rather less composure than before. "The police have asked me to come to Linden House." "Why?" Crick looked around the table. "Because someone appears to have broken into Mr. Hardwick's study." Mrs. Cattermole gasped softly. "A burglary? Possibly." "And the will?" said Bletchley. Crick's thin voice became quieter. "That," Eadstow said, "is precisely why they asked for me." He paused. "The original will appears to be missing." The committee sat perfectly still. Councillor Dodd spoke at last. "Well," he said thoughtfully, "that rather complicates the statue." Across town, in the modest police station on East Street, Inspector Purbright was listening patiently to a constable describing the contents of Ambrose Hardwick's study. The inspector had not yet heard about the statue, but he had already noticed something curious. The desk drawer from which the will had vanished showed no signs of force, and on the polished surface of the desk lay a single object which seemed oddly out of place. It was a theatre ticket, a ticket for a performance that had taken place 2 weeks after Ambrose Hardwick's death. Inspector Perbrite regarded it quietly. Then he said in his mild voice, "That," he remarked, "is rather interesting." Inspector Perbrite held the theatre ticket between finger and thumb as if it might, with sufficient courtesy, explain itself. It was stiff card, slightly glossy, and printed with the cheerful confidence of provincial entertainment. Flaxborough Amateur Dramatic Society Spring Production. Beneath it, in smaller type, the date. A date that had no business existing in the life of a man now safely dead. Sergeant Lovejoy, square-shouldered and hopeful in the way of men who preferred crimes to have handles, watched him. "Could be someone dropped it," Lovejoy offered. Perbrite looked at the desk again. Hardwick's study had been arranged with the bleak tidiness of a man who mistrusted pleasure. The blotter sat exactly square, the inkstand polished, the penknife aligned as though waiting for inspection. There was a faint smell of furniture polish and something sourer underneath, as if indignation had soaked into the wood over years. "It could," Perbrite agreed mildly. But it didn't drop itself out of a drawer and land on the centre of the desk. Constable Wren knew enough to treat silence as a personal failing, added, "There's no sign of forcing anywhere, sir. Windows are latched. Front door was locked when Mrs. Preece found the place. She's the Daily Well, she was." Mrs. Preece waited in the doorway, clutching her handbag and the moral superiority of the employed. She had the kind of face that suggested she could smell wrongdoing even through closed cupboards. "I've always said," she announced, "that house attracts bad luck. It's the way it sits, like it's sulking. And now look." Purbright turned toward her with a politeness that could have been mistaken for sympathy. "You discovered the study like this, Mrs. Preece?" "Yes, Inspector. I came as usual at 9, only my key wasn't where it always is. He kept it in the pot by the back step. Everyone knows that." "Everyone?" Mrs. Preece blinked, affronted into honesty. "Well, people. It wasn't a secret, was it? Mr. Hardwick liked to think he was private, but you can't be private in Flaxborough. Not properly." Perbrite nodded as though she had offered him a useful technical detail about locks. "And when you came in?" "The hall lamp was on. He never left that lamp on. He said it wasted electricity and encouraged moral slackness. And the study door was ajar. I don't go in there, not unless I have to. He didn't like fingerprints." Lovejoy frowned. "Did anything look missing to you?" Mrs. Preece drew herself up. "I don't go counting his possessions, Sergeant." Purbright's eyes moved, not to Mrs. Preece, but to a small smear on the desk edge, dull, as if a thumb had passed there recently. On the leather blotter lay no dust at all. The ticket looked too clean, too intentional. "Who knew about the will?" Lovejoy asked, impatiently practical. Mrs. Preece gave a sniff that contained several years of local resentment. "Mr. Crick knew, and everyone else soon enough, I expect. The town hears. It hears even when nobody speaks." As if summoned by the idea of it, gossip began at once. By the time Perbrite left Linden House, the word burglary had already undergone its first improvement and become robbery, which in Flaxborough meant there was likely a villain and certainly a scandal. On Market Lane, outside Frobisher's the grocer, Mrs. Pettigrew was pausing with her shopping basket to deliver information to anyone who stood still long enough. "They've taken the will," she said, in a tone of pleased alarm. "If you ask me, it's the committee. They don't want to build that statue, so they'll pretend it was stolen." A man with a newspaper under his arm shook his head. "You can't pretend a will is stolen." "Oh, can't you?" Mrs. Pettigrew replied. "You don't know committees. At the post office, Miss Spindle, who controlled stamps, and therefore a portion of human happiness, told a customer it's all because of those letters he wrote. Someone has been frightened. You mark my words, there are people in this town with reason to fear the truth." The customer, who had never feared anything except postage rates, murmured, "Who?" Miss Spindle looked wounded by the question. "I couldn't possibly say." In the afternoon, Perbrite visited the police station's small incident room, where Lovejoy had placed the theatre ticket in an evidence envelope with the reverence usually reserved for murder weapons. "Only one ticket, sir," he said. "Not torn, not used, just there." Perbrite studied it again. The seat number was printed plainly, the name of the play too, a light comedy whose title suggested misunderstanding and marital embarrassment. The date, however, was what held him. It was 2 weeks after Hardwick's death, and yet the ticket showed slight creasing at one corner, as though it had been carried in a pocket and handled more than once. "Who goes to the amateur dramatics?" Lovejoy asked, as if narrowing down the audience might narrow down the criminal. "Nearly everyone," Perbrite said, "and nearly no one, depending on how you define go. People buy tickets in support. They attend in duty, they avoid in principle, and some go because they enjoy it, which is the rarest motive of all." Lovejoy tried again. "So it could belong to anyone." "Yes," Perbrite replied, "which is precisely why it may not." He took his coat from the back of the chair and slipped his notebook into the inside pocket. Lovejoy watched him with the faint disappointment of a man denied a chase. "Where are you going, sir?" Perbrite paused at the door. "To see Mr. Crick." "About the will?" "About the will," Perbrite agreed. And then, as if remembering something that was almost too ordinary to matter, he added, "and to ask him why a dead man's study contains a ticket for a play he could not possibly attend." Outside, the late afternoon light sat greyly over Flaxborough, and the town continued to arrange its indignations with care. Somewhere between the Royal George and the Market Square, a story was already forming, with a villain who looked remarkably like whichever neighbour the teller liked least. Mr. Leonard Crick's office occupied the upper floor of a narrow building on High Street, squeezed respectfully between a stationery shop and a watch repairer. It was the sort of office that seemed permanently wrapped in a mild legal caution. The carpet had been chosen for durability rather than enthusiasm, and the walls carried framed certificates whose wording suggested that the law, while occasionally interesting, was not something one should approach without supervision. When Inspector Perbrite arrived, Mr. Crick was seated behind his desk, studying a file with the intense concentration of a man hoping the file might quietly resolve its own difficulties. Crick looked up and removed his spectacles with careful resignation. "Inspector Purbright. Good afternoon, Mr. Crick." Perbrite took the chair opposite without hurry. The office window overlooked High Street, where two elderly gentlemen were engaged in the slow and complex manoeuvre of disagreeing about parking. "I understand," Perbrite said mildly, "that the will of Mr. Ambrose Hardwick has unfortunately disappeared." Crick gave a tight professional nod. "Yes, a most inconvenient circumstance." "Inconvenient for whom?" Perbrite asked pleasantly. Crick paused just long enough to reveal the strain beneath his composure. "For the proper administration of the estate, naturally." Perbrite folded his hands. "And the statue," Crick winced in a small, involuntary way. "Yes, that as well." For a moment neither man spoke. Perbrite allowed the silence to stretch with gentle patience, like a man waiting for a kettle that had not yet decided whether to boil. At last Crick cleared his throat. "I imagine you wish to know who was aware of the will's existence. That would be helpful." Crick opened a notebook. "I drafted the will 6 months ago. Mr. Hardwick was quite specific about its conditions. He insisted the statue be placed where it would be visible to the public conscience, which he defined as the Market Square." Perbrite nodded thoughtfully. "Did he discuss this with anyone else?" Crick hesitated. "Not directly, perhaps. But Mr. Hardwick had a communicative nature. That is one way of describing a man who writes letters to the newspaper every fortnight." Crick allowed himself a brief reluctant smile. "Yes." "Then it would be fair to say," Perbrite continued gently, "that several people in town might have known about the statue proposal." "Quite possibly. People who might dislike the idea." Crick leaned back. "Inspector, there are people in Flaxborough who would dislike a statue of Ambrose Hardwick, even if it were placed in the middle of the North Sea." Perbrite nodded. "That suggests a wide field of interest." Crick tapped the desk with one finger. "There is, however, something you should know." Perbrite waited. "I had the original will locked in the desk at Linden House temporarily," Crick said. "Mr. Hardwick wished to review it once more before we deposited it in my safe." "Before he died?" "Yes." "And after his death?" Crick's voice tightened. "I intended to collect it the following week. I was delayed." "By what?" Crick looked faintly embarrassed. "A conveyancing matter in Bury St. Edmunds." Perbrite inclined his head. "So for several days the will remained in the desk drawer at Linden House." "Yes." "Unlocked?" "No. The drawer was locked, but the room itself was not especially secure." Crick admitted this with visible discomfort. "No." Perbrite withdrew the theatre ticket from his notebook and placed it gently on the desk between them. "I found this in the study." Crick adjusted his spectacles and examined it. "I see. Does it mean anything to you?" Crick shook his head slowly. "I rarely attend amateur dramatics. That is not quite what I asked." Crick hesitated again. "I cannot imagine Mr. Hardwick attending either. He once described the dramatic society as public enthusiasm organized against good taste. Purbright smiled faintly. And yet the ticket was in his study. Crick stared at it as though the ticket might explain itself if approached from the correct legal angle. I suppose someone might have left it there. Possibly. Perbrite rose slowly. One last question, Mr. Crick. Yes. Who stands to gain if the will cannot be found? Crick's expression became careful again. In that case, the estate would pass according to the earlier will. And who benefits under that? Crick reached for another file. The principal beneficiary would be Mr. Hardwick's nephew. Perbright's eyebrows lifted slightly. Indeed. Mr. Colin Hardwick of Birmingham. Does he live there still? As far as I know. Perbrite placed the ticket back in his pocket. And when were you last in contact with him? Crick thought for a moment. I wrote to him after the funeral. Did he reply? Yes. Crick opened a drawer and produced a letter. He said he might visit Flaxborough soon. Perbrite accepted the letter, briefly scanning the neat handwriting. Has he arrived yet? Crick shook his head. Not that I am aware of. Perbrite returned the letter. Thank you, Mr. Crick. You've been most helpful. As he reached the door, Crick spoke again. Inspector? Perbrite paused. Do you believe this was a burglary? Perbrite considered the question. I believe, he said quietly, that someone entered that study for a very particular reason. Crick swallowed. The will? Yes. And the theatre ticket? Perbright's mild smile returned. That, he said, is what makes the matter interesting. Outside the office, High Street had grown busier with the small, steady traffic of afternoon errands. Perbrite stood for a moment beside the pavement, looking at the theatre ticket again. Then he folded it carefully and slipped it back into his pocket. Across the road, the notice board outside the town hall displayed a bright poster for the upcoming amateur play. Perbrite glanced at it thoughtfully, and then he crossed the street. Inspector Perbrite paused before the notice board outside the town hall, with the unhurried air of a man who had nowhere urgent to be, and every intention of noticing things others ignored. The poster for the Flaxborough Amateur Dramatic Society had been pinned carefully at eye level. It displayed cheerful lettering, a sketch of a drawing-room sofa, and the promise of an evening's harmless confusion entitled A Husband Mislaid. The performance date, which Perbrite had already committed to memory from the ticket in his pocket, sat prominently near the bottom. 2 weeks after Ambrose Hardwick's death. He regarded it for a moment, then stepped inside the town hall, where the Dramatic Society kept a modest office beside the council records room. Inside, Miss Dorothy Frobisher sat at a desk surrounded by theatre programmes, pencils, and an alarming quantity of ribbon. She was a tall woman with an expression of capable enthusiasm and the faintly tragic air common to those who organised amateur theatre. She looked up. Oh, Inspector Purbright. Good afternoon, Miss Frobisher. She folded her hands expectantly. If this is about the missing will, she said, I can assure you the Dramatic Society has nothing to do with it. Perbrite smiled mildly. That is reassuring. I was actually hoping to ask about tickets. Miss Frobisher brightened slightly. Theatre tickets were a subject she understood. Yes. Perbrite produced the ticket and laid it gently on the desk. This one in particular. Miss Frobisher examined it. Row C, seat 7. Does that tell you anything? Not especially, she said. People buy them all the time. Sometimes they come, sometimes they don't. Flaxborough has a very flexible attitude to attendance. Do you keep a record of purchases? Oh yes, we must, for the accounts. She opened a ledger and began turning pages with the care of someone who regarded handwriting as a moral statement. Row C, seat 7, her finger stopped. Ah, Perbrite waited. The ticket was purchased 3 days before Mr. Hardwick died. By whom? Miss Frobisher peered more closely. Well now, that's curious. How so? The name written here is Mr. Colin Hardwick. Purbright's eyebrows lifted a fraction. The nephew? Yes, though I've never met him. When did he buy the ticket? Miss Frobisher checked the entry again. 3 days before the funeral. Purbright considered this quietly. Did he collect it personally? No, it was sent by post to Linden House. Yes, of course. Perbrite nodded slowly. That explained why the ticket had been in the study. But it explained something else as well. If Colin Hardwick had written to purchase a theatre ticket addressed to Linden House, it suggested he had expected to be in Flaxborough, perhaps sooner than anyone had realised. Miss Frobisher closed the ledger. I assume this has something to do with the statue business, she said. Possibly. I must say, she added with polite firmness, the Dramatic Society would not oppose a statue in principle, though Mr. Hardwick once described our last production as a public rehearsal for embarrassment. Perbrite allowed himself a small nod. Did he attend often? Never. Did he know anyone involved in the society? Miss Frobisher thought for a moment. Well, he occasionally corresponded with Mr. Gerald Pike, the Chronicle editor. Yes, Mr. Pike sponsors the theatre programmes, advertisements, and so forth. Purbright made a quiet note in his mind. Thank you, Miss Frobisher. You've been most helpful. He stepped back into the afternoon light of the square, where the slow rhythm of town life continued with the determined normality of people who believed small scandals would eventually settle into respectable stories. Sergeant Lovejoy was waiting beside the police car. You found something, sir? Perbrite showed him the ticket again. It belongs to Mr. Hardwick's nephew. Lovejoy frowned. The same nephew who inherits if the will's gone? Yes. Lovejoy considered this with uncomplicated suspicion. That's convenient. Very. Do we know where he is now? Perbrite glanced toward the post office clock. I believe, he said, we may soon find out. Lovejoy blinked. Why? Perbrite gestured toward the railway station road. Because the afternoon train from Birmingham arrives in 11 minutes. Lovejoy straightened. You think he's coming today? I think, Perbrite replied calmly, that a man who bought a theatre ticket in advance of his uncle's death may have had plans involving Flaxborough. They walked toward the station in companionable silence. As they approached the platform, the train whistle sounded faintly in the distance. Lovejoy shifted his weight. And if he is the one who took the will? Perbrite looked down the line where the train would soon appear. Then we must ask him why. The train arrived with a gentle hiss of steam and a brief confusion of luggage and polite apologies. Passengers stepped onto the platform one by one. Among them was a tall, neatly dressed young man carrying a leather suitcase. He paused, looked around the quiet station, and asked the porter a question. The porter pointed toward the town. Sergeant Lovejoy leaned closer. That him? Perbrite watched the man for a moment. Yes, Colin Hardwick. The nephew adjusted his coat and began walking toward the exit. Perbrite stepped forward to meet him, and as he did, he noticed something small but interesting. Tucked into the pocket of the young man's coat was another theatre ticket. The tall young man with the leather suitcase had just reached the station exit when Inspector Perbrite stepped forward with the mild confidence of someone who had already decided the conversation would be polite. Mr. Colin Hardwick, I believe? The young man stopped. His expression shifted through the brief stages of surprise, calculation, and polite acceptance. Yes, I'm Inspector. So I'm Perbrite. Colin Hardwick nodded. I thought it might be the police, he said. When one arrives in a town shortly after a burglary involving one's late uncle, it tends to attract attention. Perbrite regarded him thoughtfully. You're well informed. My uncle's solicitor telephoned this morning. Lovejoy shifted slightly behind the inspector, watching the nephew with the alert patience of a man who liked events to confirm his suspicions. Perbrite gestured toward the small station waiting room. "Perhaps we might talk inside." Colin Hardwick agreed without hesitation. Inside the waiting room, the air carried the faint smell of coal dust and railway timetables. A wooden bench creaked politely as the three men sat. Purbright allowed a moment of silence before speaking. "You were expecting to come to Flaxborough?" Colin tilted his head slightly. "Yes." "You purchased a theatre ticket before your uncle died." Colin's hand moved instinctively to his coat pocket. He withdrew the ticket Purbright had already noticed. "I did. Why?" Colin studied the ticket with faint amusement. "I thought I might enjoy a play." "While visiting your uncle?" "Yes." Lovejoy frowned. "You bought it 3 days before he died." "That's correct." "You planned the visit in advance?" Colin nodded. "My uncle had written to me." Perbrite leaned forward slightly. "What did he say?" Colin placed the ticket on the bench between them. "He said he wished to discuss a family matter, something he described as a necessary correction to the moral balance of Flaxborough." Lovejoy blinked. "That sounds like him." Colin smiled faintly. "You knew my uncle?" "Everyone in town knew him," Lovejoy replied, whether they wanted to or not. Perbrite watched Colin quietly. "When did you receive the letter?" "About a week before he died." "And you plan to visit?" "Yes." "I wrote back saying I would come." "Did he reply again?" "No." Perbrite nodded thoughtfully. "So when you arrived today you expected to find your uncle alive, or at least buried with dignity," Colin said dryly. Lovejoy looked at the suitcase. "You've come for the inheritance, then?" Colin shrugged lightly. "That depends. On what? On whether the inheritance exists." Perbrite smiled slightly. "You're referring to the missing will?" "Yes. You knew about the statue condition?" Colin's eyebrows lifted. "A statue?" "Yes." Colin laughed softly. "I had no idea." Perbrite watched him carefully. The reaction seemed genuine. "You were unaware that your uncle intended to leave £20,000 to the Civic Improvement Committee for a statue?" "In his honour." Colin leaned back on the bench. "That is magnificently like him." Lovejoy crossed his arms. "You don't sound disappointed." Colin considered the question. "My uncle and I had an understanding. He disliked the town. I disliked his letters to the newspaper." "So you didn't expect to inherit?" "I expected conversation." Perbrite studied him for a moment. "And yet you bought theatre tickets." Colin glanced at the ticket again. "Yes." Perbrite said nothing. After a moment Colin sighed. "All right, not just for myself." "For whom?" "For my uncle." Lovejoy frowned. "Your uncle hated amateur theatre, so he said." Colin smiled faintly, but in his letter he mentioned wanting to observe the social behaviour of Flaxborough in its natural habitat. Lovejoy blinked. "You mean he wanted to watch the audience?" "Exactly." Perbrite nodded slowly. "That sounds consistent." Colin slipped the ticket back into his pocket. "I assumed we would attend together." "And when you arrived today?" "I intended to stay at Linden House." Lovejoy looked sharply at him. "You've already been there?" Colin shook his head. "No, I came straight from the station." Perbrite watched him carefully. "You haven't visited the house yet?" "No." Lovejoy leaned forward. "Because the study was broken into." Colin looked genuinely surprised. "I know, and the will taken." "Yes," Lovejoy said bluntly. "So that benefits you?" Colin did not appear offended. "So I'm told." Purbright rose from the bench. "Mr. Hardwick, would you mind if we accompanied you to Linden House?" Colin stood and picked up his suitcase. "Not at all." The three men stepped out of the station into the cool afternoon air. As they walked toward Market Lane, the town moved around them with its usual quiet mixture of errands and speculation. Outside the Royal George, 2 committee members were already discussing the possible fate of the statue with grave civic anxiety. Lovejoy walked slightly ahead, still watching the nephew. "You realize," he said, "that if the will cannot be found, the estate passes to you." Colin nodded calmly. "Yes. And that gives you a reason to remove it." "Certainly." Lovejoy stopped walking. "You're admitting that rather easily." Colin looked at him with mild curiosity. "Sergeant, if I had stolen the will, I would hardly arrive in town carrying the theatre ticket I bought before my uncle died." Lovejoy opened his mouth to reply. But Perbrite had stopped walking. He was looking toward Linden House. Something had changed. The front door of the narrow Georgian house stood slightly open, and on the doorstep, leaning awkwardly against the doorframe, lay a small brown envelope. Purbright approached it slowly. He bent down and picked it up. The envelope was addressed in neat handwriting, "To Inspector Purbright." Lovejoy stared. "What's inside?" Purbright opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper and one sentence written in dark ink. "The will is exactly where Mr. Hardwick wanted it to be." Perbrite read the sentence twice, then he folded the paper and placed it quietly in his pocket. Lovejoy waited. "Well?" Perbrite looked back at the silent house. "I believe," he said softly, "that Mr. Hardwick's final arrangements may have been more elaborate than anyone realized." Inspector Perbrite remained standing on the narrow step of Linden House for a few seconds after placing the note into his pocket. The open door creaked faintly in the breeze, as though the house itself had opinions about being entered. Sergeant Lovejoy shifted his weight. "Well, sir?" Perbrite pushed the door gently with one hand. It opened without resistance. "I think," he said mildly, "we should see whether Mr. Hardwick has left any further instructions." They stepped inside. Linden House possessed the faintly severe character of a place arranged by a man who believed comfort led inevitably to moral decline. The hall contained a narrow umbrella stand, a stiff-backed chair, and a framed print of a naval battle whose smoke seemed to disapprove of everything beneath it. Colin Hardwick set his suitcase quietly by the wall. "So this is where he lived?" "You've never visited before?" Lovejoy asked. "No, my uncle preferred correspondence." Purbright closed the front door behind them. The latch clicked with a tidy finality. "Mrs. Priest said the hall lamp was left on when she arrived yesterday," he observed. Lovejoy glanced at the switch. "It's off now." "Yes." Purbright walked toward the study at the end of the corridor. The door stood half open exactly as it had the previous day. Inside, the desk still held its disciplined arrangement of objects. The blotter lay smooth, the penknife straight, the inkstand polished to a quiet shine. Only the missing will disturbed the order. Lovejoy looked around the room with professional dissatisfaction. "If someone left that note outside just now," he said, "they must have been watching the house." Perbrite nodded faintly. "Possibly. Or they knew we'd come here, also possible." Colin Hardwick stood near the bookcase, examining the titles with mild curiosity. "My uncle read a great deal of local history. He also wrote a great deal of local criticism," Lovejoy said. Perbrite moved slowly around the desk. "What do you remember about your uncle's habits, Mr. Hardwick?" Colin thought for a moment. "Precision," he said. "Everything had its place. He disliked disorder in the same way some people dislike noise." Perbrite gestured toward the desk. "Does anything here appear out of place to you?" Colin stepped forward. He studied the objects carefully. "The ticket you found was not his," he said. "No." But otherwise his eyes moved across the blotter, the penknife, the small brass letter opener. Then he frowned slightly. "That." Perbrite followed his gaze. On the far corner of the desk sat a small porcelain paperweight shaped like a lighthouse. "What about it?" Lovejoy asked. Colin tilted his head. My uncle hated ornaments. Perbrite lifted the paperweight gently. It was heavier than it appeared. "Interesting." Lovejoy leaned closer. "Maybe someone left it." Perbrite turned it over. The base was hollow. Inside the hollow base was a folded scrap of paper. Lovejoy's eyebrows rose. "Well?" Perbrite removed the paper and unfolded it carefully. 3 words had again. "Yes." Lovejoy scratched his head again. "Yes." Lovejoy scratched his head. "You think he hid the will with the newspaper office?" "Not necessarily. But the note says the Chronicle knows." "Yes." Perbrite looked toward the window. Outside, Market Lane moved with its usual quiet traffic of bicycles, prams, and cautious gossip. The office of the Flaxborough Chronicle stood 2 streets away. Lovejoy was already reaching for his hat. "Shall we go ask them?" Perbrite slipped the paper into his notebook. "In a moment." He walked slowly around the study once more, his eyes resting on the shelves of books, the framed letters from the editor, and the neat rows of envelopes tied with string. "Mr. Hardwick was a man who believed in public opinion," he said quietly. Colin nodded. "He certainly attempted to influence it." Perbrite stopped beside the desk again. "And yet," he continued, "if he wished the Chronicle to know something, he would not hide it privately in a paperweight." Lovejoy frowned. "Then what does it mean?" Perbrite smiled faintly. "I suspect Mr. Hardwick expected the Chronicle to reveal it." Colin looked thoughtful. "You mean he told them before he died?" "Possibly." Lovejoy shrugged. "Then why steal the will?" Perbrite placed the lighthouse paperweight back on the desk exactly where it had been. "That," he said, "is the question." At that moment a faint sound came from the hall. The front door opened. Lovejoy turned quickly. Footsteps entered the house. A moment later a man appeared in the doorway of the study. He was short, round-faced, and carried the comfortable authority of someone accustomed to controlling headlines. "Inspector Purbright," he said cheerfully. Perbrite recognized him immediately. Gerald Pike, editor of the Flaxborough Chronicle. Pike glanced at the 3 men in the room and smiled with mild amusement. "I suspected you might be here." Lovejoy narrowed his eyes. "Did you?" "Yes." Pike adjusted his coat. "After all," he said pleasantly, "when someone writes a note saying the Chronicle knows, one can hardly avoid becoming involved." Perbrite regarded him calmly. "Then perhaps," he said, "you could explain exactly what it is your newspaper knows." Pike looked around the study once more. His smile faded slightly. "Well," he said, "I believe Mr. Hardwick left us something rather unusual." Gerald Pike removed his hat with the careful civility of a man accustomed to entering other people's rooms with information that might disturb them. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything," he said pleasantly. Sergeant Lovejoy looked around the study. "Only a burglary investigation." Pike nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, I gathered as much." Inspector Perbrite gestured toward the empty chair beside the desk. "Perhaps you would care to explain your remark." Pike sat down and smoothed the front of his coat with the air of someone settling into a conversation he had been expecting all day. "Well," he said, "it began on Monday morning, before Mr. Hardwick died," Perbrite observed. "Exactly." Pike clasped his hands together. "Mr. Hardwick visited the Chronicle office. Quite unexpectedly. He carried a sealed envelope and informed me rather dramatically that it contained something which the town of Flaxborough would one day find instructive." Lovejoy frowned. "Instructive?" That was the word he used. Perbrite watched him carefully. "What did he ask you to do with the envelope?" "He asked me to keep it safe until the right moment." "And when would that be?" Pike smiled faintly. "When someone attempted to interfere with his final arrangements." Lovejoy blinked. So he expected trouble. "Mr. Hardwick," Pike said dryly. Expected trouble as a matter of principle. Perbrite nodded. "What exactly is inside this envelope?" Pike spread his hands. "That, Inspector, is something I have not yet examined." Lovejoy leaned forward. "You mean you didn't open it?" "No, why not?" Pike's expression remained calm. "Because Mr. Hardwick asked me not to. He said it would be far more interesting if the truth emerged publicly." Lovejoy muttered under his breath. Typical. Perbrite remained thoughtful. "And you believe the missing will is connected to this envelope?" "Yes." "Why?" Pike glanced around the room as though measuring the walls against memory. "Because Mr. Hardwick said the envelope would make the will difficult to ignore." Colin Hardwick, who had been standing near the window, spoke for the first time since Pike entered. "My uncle always preferred audiences." Pike nodded politely, yes. He believed private revelations lacked educational value. Purbright smiled faintly. "Where is the envelope now, Mr. Pike?" "In the Chronicle office." "Locked?" "Certainly." Lovejoy stood up. "Then perhaps we should go and look at it." Pike rose slowly. "I expected you might suggest that." They left Linden House together and walked through Market Lane toward the Chronicle building. The late afternoon had begun to drift toward evening, and the small shops were closing one by one with the quiet finality of turned keys. As they passed the Royal George, two members of the Civic Improvement Committee paused mid-conversation and watched them with keen interest. One whispered something, the other nodded gravely. The town, it seemed, was beginning to feel that something important was about to happen. The Chronicle office stood at the corner of High Street, a narrow brick building whose windows displayed neat rows of newspapers and advertisements for local events. Inside, the printing room carried the smell of ink and warm paper. Pike led them to a small office at the back. On the desk sat a metal lockbox. "There," he said. Lovejoy folded his arms. "Open it." Pike produced a key and unlocked the box with deliberate calm. Inside lay a single, sealed envelope. It was thick, cream-coloured, and addressed in Ambrose Hardwick's unmistakable handwriting. "To the editor of the Flaxborough Chronicle." Below that, another line had been added in darker ink. "To be opened only if my will becomes inconvenient." Lovejoy exhaled slowly. "Well." Perbrite examined the envelope carefully. The seal remained intact. "Did anyone else know about this?" he asked. Pike shook his head. "Only Mr. Hardwick and myself." "And now us," Lovejoy said. Perbrite looked toward Colin Hardwick. "You've never seen this before?" "No. Did your uncle mention leaving anything with the newspaper?" "No." Perbrite nodded slowly. "Then I think it may be time to see what Mr. Hardwick considered educational." Pike hesitated. "Are you certain?" Perbright's mild expression did not change. "Very." Pike broke the seal. Inside the envelope were 3 items. The first was a typed letter, the second was a folded document, the third was a small photograph. Lovejoy leaned forward. "What's the letter say?" Pike read silently for a moment. Then his eyebrows rose slightly. "Well," he said, "that explains a great deal." Perbrite waited. "What does it say?" Pike looked at him carefully. "It says that if anyone attempted to remove the will from Linden House, yes, then the Chronicle should publish the enclosed photograph." Lovejoy glanced at the picture. "And what's on the photograph?" Pike turned it toward them. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Lovejoy stared. "Well, I'll be." The photograph showed the study at Linden House, but not as it looked now. It showed someone standing beside the desk, opening the drawer, where the will had been kept. Inspector Perbrite leaned closer. The face of the person in the photograph was perfectly clear, and it was not Colin Hardwick. For several seconds after Gerald Pike turned the photograph toward them, The room remained very quiet. Sergeant Lovejoy leaned closer to the desk, squinting slightly as though the picture might alter itself if viewed from another angle. "Well," he said at last, "that's not what I expected." Inspector Purbright said nothing immediately. He studied the photograph with the patient attention of a man who preferred details to conclusions. The image had clearly been taken inside the study at Linden House. The desk was unmistakable, the inkstand, the leather blotter, the neatly aligned penknife. And beside the desk stood a man. He was bending slightly, his hand inside the drawer where the will had been kept. His face was turned toward the camera. There was no uncertainty about the identity. Gerald Pike cleared his throat. "I take it you recognize him." Lovejoy let out a low whistle. "Oh, yes." Colin Hardwick, who had been standing slightly behind the others, stepped forward. "May I see it?" Pike handed him the photograph. Colin examined it calmly, though his eyebrows lifted faintly after a moment. "That," he said quietly, "is rather unfortunate." Lovejoy nodded. "For him." Perbrite folded his hands. Indeed, the man in the photograph was Mr. Leonard Crick, the town solicitor. The same careful gentleman who had explained the will, described its conditions, and expressed such concern about its disappearance. Lovejoy straightened slowly. "Well," he said, "that makes things simpler." Perbrite did not immediately agree. "It makes them clearer." Colin Hardwick returned the photograph to the desk. "I assume my uncle arranged this." "Very likely," Perbrite said. Pike leaned back slightly in his chair. "The letter mentions a camera." Lovejoy looked at him. "A camera? Yes. Mr. Hardwick wrote that he had installed a small device in the study to ensure that any interference with his will would be documented." Lovejoy shook his head in disbelief. "He set a trap." "Precisely." Perbrite considered the photograph again. "The camera appears to have been placed somewhere above the bookcase," he said thoughtfully. Lovejoy frowned. "But if Crick took the will, why report the burglary?" "Because," Perbrite said mildly, "he did not know the camera existed." Colin nodded. "That sounds like my uncle." Lovejoy folded his arms. "So Crick steals the will, thinking no one will know, and then helps the investigation." Pike gave a small smile. "A bold strategy." Perbrite remained thoughtful. "Possibly." Lovejoy looked at him. "You don't sound convinced, sir." Perbrite glanced at the photograph again. "There are still questions." "Such as?" Perbrite tapped the desk gently. "For example, when exactly was this photograph taken?" Lovejoy blinked. "When he stole the will?" "Perhaps." Perbrite pointed to the image. "Notice the position of the lamp." Lovejoy leaned closer. The desk lamp in the photograph was switched on. "But Mrs. Priest said the lamp was already on when she arrived the next morning," Lovejoy said. "Yes." "And?" Perbrite's voice remained calm. "That suggests the photograph was taken at night." Lovejoy frowned. So, Perbrite continued, "Mr. Crick would have had to enter the house after dark." Pike nodded slowly. "That would be noticeable." Colin Hardwick looked thoughtful. "My uncle locked his doors carefully." Lovejoy scratched his head. "Maybe Crick had a key." "Possibly." Perbrite studied the photograph again, but there is another detail. He pointed to the desk. Beside the drawer lay the porcelain lighthouse paperweight, exactly where they had found it earlier. "But the note inside the paperweight referred to the Chronicle," Lovejoy said. "Yes, and we only discovered that today." Perbrite nodded, "which means the paperweight had not been moved." Lovejoy blinked. "So?" Perbrite looked at him patiently. "If Mr. Crick had searched the desk thoroughly while stealing the will, he would almost certainly have examined the paperweight." Lovejoy stared at the photograph again. The solicitor's hand was clearly inside the drawer. but the rest of the desk remained untouched. You think he would? Perbrite looked toward the window. As the solicitor who drafted it, he would. Purbright looked toward the window. Outside, evening light had begun to settle across High Street. However, he said quietly, "There remains one final difficulty." Lovejoy waited. What difficulty? Purbright tapped the photograph once more. If Mr. Crick removed the will that night, then someone else must have returned to Linden House afterward. Lovejoy blinked. Why? Purbright reached into his pocket and removed the note they had found on the doorstep. He placed it beside the photograph. The will is exactly where Mr. Hardwick wanted it to be. Lovejoy stared at the two items. You think the person who wrote that note knows where the will is? Yes. And that person isn't Crick. Purbright smiled faintly. That, he said, is what we must now determine. Colin Hardwick glanced from "To speak with Mr. Crick again, Inspector," to "Speak with Mr. Crick again." Inspector Perbrite did not hurry when leaving the Chronicle office. The evening air over High Street carried the familiar mixture of bakery warmth, distant traffic, and the quiet stirrings of speculation that accompany a town convinced it is on the brink of a revelation. Sergeant Lovejoy walked beside him with the restless energy of a man who preferred revelations to arrive promptly. "Well, sir," Lovejoy said, "we've got a photograph of Crick taking the will. That's fairly direct." Perbrite nodded mildly. "Yes. Shall we arrest him?" Perbrite looked at the sky for a moment as if considering the weather. "Not yet." Lovejoy frowned. "Why not?" "Because," Perbrite said gently, "we still do not know why the will is no longer in his possession." They turned the corner. Suggested the solicitor was working late. Suggested the solicitor was working late, either out of diligence or discomfort. Perbrite climbed the narrow stairs and knocked. Crick opened the door after a moment. He looked faintly tired, though still composed in the careful manner of a man accustomed to unpleasant documents. "Inspector." "Good evening, Mr. Crick." Crick's eyes flicked briefly to Lovejoy. "I assume this is about the missing will." "In part." Perbrite stepped inside. The office was exactly as before, orderly, cautious, and faintly defensive. Crick returned to his chair. "Have you discovered anything new?" Perbrite placed the photograph quietly on the desk. Crick looked down at it. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he removed his spectacles, cleaned them carefully with a handkerchief, and put them back on. "Well," he said quietly, "that is awkward." Lovejoy folded his arms. "That's one word for it." Crick studied the photograph again. "I assume Mr. Hardwick arranged this?" "Yes." Crick sighed softly. "I suspected he might." Lovejoy leaned forward. "So you admit you took the will?" Crick looked at him calmly. "Yes." The answer arrived so easily that Lovejoy blinked. "You just admit it?" "Of course." Perbrite watched him carefully. "Why?" Crick rested his hands on the desk. "Because the statute clause was absurd." Lovejoy raised an eyebrow. "Absurd enough to steal a will?" Crick gave a thin smile. "Sergeant, I have practiced law in this town for 25 years. I am quite capable of recognizing when a man intends to embarrass half the population." Perbrite nodded slightly. "And you wish to prevent the embarrassment?" "Precisely. So you removed the will?" "Yes." "On the night after Mr. Hardwick died?" "Yes." Perbrite's tone remained gentle. "You knew exactly where it was. I drafted it." Lovejoy tapped the photograph. "You didn't know about the key camera?" "No." Crick folded his hands. "I intended to destroy the document quietly and allow the earlier will to take effect." Lovejoy shook his head. "That's fraud." "Yes," Crick said calmly, "but socially beneficial fraud." Perbrite regarded him with mild curiosity. "And what happened after you removed the will?" Crick hesitated for the first time. I took it home. And, Crick leaned back slowly in his chair, and the following morning it was gone. Lovejoy stared. Gone? Yes. You mean someone stole it from you? Crick nodded. Perbrite spoke quietly. Where had you kept it? In my desk drawer. Locked? Yes. Who has access to your office? No one. Lovejoy snorted. Convenient. Crick met his gaze without irritation. Unfortunately true. Purbright walked slowly to the window. So the will was stolen twice. That appears to be the case. Lovejoy rubbed his chin. And whoever took it from you left that note on the doorstep. Crick looked puzzled. What note? Purbright took the folded paper from his pocket and placed it beside the photograph. Crick read it silently. The will is exactly where Mr. Hardwick wanted it to be. He frowned. I did not write that. Purbright nodded. I did not expect you had. The room fell quiet again. After a moment, Crick spoke carefully. There is something else you should know. Perbrite turned. Yes? Crick opened a drawer and removed a small envelope. I found this in my office this afternoon. He slid it across the desk. Perbrite opened it. Inside was a single theatre ticket. Row C, seat 7. The same seat number as the ticket found in Hardwick's study. Lovejoy frowned. What's that supposed to mean? Crick shook his head slowly. There was no note, just the ticket. Perbrite examined it thoughtfully. Another invitation. To what? Perbrite looked at the ticket again. To the play? Lovejoy blinked. You think the will's at the theatre? Perbrite slipped the ticket into his pocket. I think, he said, faintly across the square. And on its faintly across the square? And on its notice board the poster for the amateur play fluttered slightly in the evening wind. Inspector Perbrite crossed the market square slowly, his hands folded behind his back in the mild, thoughtful manner that often caused Sergeant Lovejoy to feel events were proceeding at an unnecessarily civilized pace. The lights of the town hall were already shining through the tall windows. Inside, the Flaxborough Amateur Dramatic Society was preparing for its evening rehearsal, and the faint sound of chairs scraping across wooden floors drifted out into the square. Lovejoy walked beside him, glancing repeatedly at the theatre ticket, now resting in Purbright's coat pocket. So you think the will's in there? He said. I think, Perbrite replied gently, Mr. Hardwick intended the final stage of his arrangements to occur there. Lovejoy frowned. You mean tonight? Yes. They climbed the steps to the town hall entrance. The double doors stood open, and inside the foyer several members of the Dramatic Society were arranging programs and arguing quietly about curtain timings. Miss Dorothy Frobisher looked up as Purbright entered. Inspector. Good evening, Miss Frobisher. We're only rehearsing tonight, she said. The performance isn't until Friday. That will not be a problem. Lovejoy glanced around the hall. Is everyone here? Miss Frobisher considered. Most of them. Anyone from the Civic Improvement Committee? Perbrite asked. Oh, yes, she said. Mr. Bletchley and Councillor Dodd are both helping with the stage lighting. They insisted the hall must be inspected for public dignity. Lovejoy muttered quietly. That'll be the statue panic. Perbrite nodded politely. And Mr. Gerald Pike? He arrived a few minutes ago, Miss Frobisher said. He said something about covering the rehearsal for the Chronicle. Lovejoy raised an eyebrow. Convenient. Perbrite smiled faintly. Yes. And Mr. Leonard Crick? Perbrite asked. Miss Frobisher pointed toward the rear of the hall. He's speaking with Mr. Bletchley. Lovejoy blinked. You invited him? Perbrite shook his head. I merely suggested he might find the rehearsal interesting. They moved through the hall toward the stage area. Under the bright rehearsal light stood a curious gathering of Flaxborough respectability. Mr. Harold Bletchley, stiff-backed and civic-minded, Councillor Percy Dodd, nodding gravely at the lighting technician, Gerald Pike, leaning comfortably against the stage rail, and Leonard Crick, who looked faintly uneasy now that the photograph from the Chronicle envelope had entered the conversation. Colin Hardwick stood slightly apart near the front row of seats, watching everything with quiet curiosity. When Perbrite entered, several heads turned. Bletchley spoke first. "Inspector, we were not at—" Inefficiency. Perbrite stepped onto the inefficiency. Perbrite stepped onto the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you will forgive the interruption, but there is a small matter concerning Mr. Ambrose Hardwick's will." The room grew very still. Bletchley cleared his throat. "Ah, yes, the statue. Quite." Lovejoy moved uncomfortably. Perbrite glanced briefly uncomfortably. Perbrite glanced briefly toward him, but continued speaking. He therefore arranged a number of safeguards. Pike nodded. "The photograph?" "Yes." Murmurs spread softly through the room. Councillor Dodd whispered to Bletchley, "Camera traps, very modern." Perbrite raised one hand slightly. But the photograph was only the first part of his arrangement. He removed the theatre ticket from his pocket. Mr. Hardwick also ensured that several people would receive invitations to this hall. Lovejoy looked around the room. "2 tickets, same seat number." Perbrite nodded. "Row C, seat 7. Miss Frobisher frowned slightly. "That seat is reserved tonight for the rehearsal observer." "Exactly." Perbrite stepped down from the stage and walked toward the 3rd row of seats. He stopped beside seat 7. The chair looked perfectly ordinary. Perbrite bent slightly and lifted the seat cushion. Beneath it lay a small sealed envelope. The audience in the hall collectively inhaled. Lovejoy stepped forward. "Is that it?" Perbrite examined the handwriting. Ambrose Hardwick's unmistakable angular script covered the front. "To be opened in the presence of those concerned." Bletchley's face turned slightly pale. "You mean the will?" Perbrite nodded. It would appear Mr. Hardwick anticipated the possibility that his solicitor might attempt to remove the original document. Crick swallowed. "I see." Perbrite held the envelope up calmly. "And he therefore placed the true will somewhere considerably more public." Pike smiled faintly. "A stage, yes." Lovejoy crossed his arms. "So the real will's been sitting under that chair all along?" Perbrite considered the envelope. "Possibly." Bletchley looked horrified. "In the theatre?" "Yes," Councillor Dodd whispered. "The town will never hear the end of it." Perbrite turned the envelope slowly in his hands. "I believe," he said quietly, "Mr. Hardwick intended exactly that." He broke the seal. Inside the envelope lay the final document. The room held its breath as he unfolded it. Perbrite glanced down at the first page. Then he looked up again at the assembled faces of Flaxborough, and he smiled very slightly. Because Ambrose Hardwick's final instructions were not quite what anyone in the room had expected. "Now generate the final section of the story, ensuring a satisfying resolution. Maintain the logical progression of clues and character arcs, delivering the final reveal smoothly while keeping the ending impactful and true to the detective's style." Inspector Perbrite allowed the quiet in the town hall to deepen before he began reading. The members of the Dramatic Society, the Civic Improvement Committee, and the various observers of Flaxborough respectability sat in their seats with the particular stillness of people who sensed that events were about to become memorable. Perbrite adjusted the document slightly in the stage light. "Mr. Ambrose Hardwick's final will," he said calmly, "contains several revisions to the document previously described by Mr. Leonard Crick." Crick shifted faintly where he stood. Perbrite continued. "The earlier version of the will now removed from Linden House did indeed contain the clause concerning a statue in Market Square." A low murmur moved through the hall. Mr. Bletchley coughed nervously. "Yes, the statue, yes," Perbrite said mildly. "However, the document presently in my hands contains a later amendment." He turned the page. In this final version, Mr. Hardwick states that the statute clause was inserted deliberately as what he describes as a test of the town's moral flexibility. Gerald Pike smiled faintly. "That sounds like him." Perbrite nodded. Mr. Hardwick further writes that if the will were tampered with, he expected the matter to reveal which citizens of Flaxborough preferred convenience to honesty. Several eyes drifted toward Leonard Crick. Crick remained pale but composed. Purbright continued reading. "The will states that the entire sum of £20,000 is to be donated not to the Civic Improvement Committee, but to the Flaxborough Amateur Dramatic Society for the construction of a permanent theatre fund." Miss Frobisher gasped softly. "For us?" "Yes." A ripple of surprised conversation spread across the clause. He turned to the final page. Mr. Bletchley looked stunned. "But the flower beds—" Perbrite raised a hand slightly, and the room quieted again. "There is one further clause." He turned to the final page. "Mr. Hardwick instructs that the truth concerning any attempt to interfere with the will be made publicly known so that the town may consider the character of those involved." Lovejoy glanced meaningfully toward Crick. Perbrite folded the document slowly. "Which brings us to the matter of Mr. Leonard Crick." Crick cleared his throat. "I have already admitted removing the earlier will." "Yes," Perbrite said, "but you did not ultimately succeed in concealing the document." Crick looked puzzled. "No," Perbrite continued calmly, "because someone removed it from your office the following morning." Lovejoy nodded. "That part still needs explaining." Perbrite turned slightly toward the front row. "Mr. Colin Hardwick." The nephew looked up with mild interest. "Yes?" "You visited your uncle's house the morning after his death." Colin smiled faintly. "I suspected you might conclude that." Lovejoy blinked. "You did?" "Yes." Colin stood slowly. "My uncle's letter suggested he expected difficulties with the will." Perbrite nodded. "So you came early?" "Yes." "I arrived the morning after the funeral. You entered Linden House using the spare key in the garden pot." "Yes." "And you discovered that the will had already been removed." Colin glanced briefly at Crick. "I did." Lovejoy frowned. "So you went to Crick's office?" Colin nodded. "My uncle had warned me that the solicitor might misunderstand his intentions." Crick stared at him. "You broke into my office?" "Only briefly." "And you took the will?" "Yes." Lovejoy shook his head. "Why not go straight to the police?" Colin smiled slightly. "Because my uncle's instructions were quite clear." Perbrite nodded. "He wanted the truth revealed publicly." "Yes." Colin gestured toward the hall. "Preferably with an audience?" Miss Frobisher looked delighted. "This is very theatrical." Pike laughed softly. "Ambrose Hardwick's final production," Perbrite continued. "You then hid the real will beneath seat 7 in the town hall?" "Yes, and left the notes guiding us here." Colin nodded. "Exactly as my uncle intended." Lovejoy crossed his arms. "So the whole town had to gather before the will could appear?" "Yes." Crick spoke quietly. "I see." Perbrite looked toward him. "You attempted to prevent the embarrassment of the statute clause." "Yes." But Mr. Hardwick had already removed that clause from the final document. Crick closed his eyes briefly. "I realize that now." Perbrite's voice remained gentle. "Which means the only real consequence of your actions is the public revelation of your attempt." Crick sighed. "That will be quite enough consequence." The room slowly relaxed. Miss Frobisher clutched the will happily. "A theatre fund," Bletchley muttered to Dodd. "At least there's no statue." Pike folded his arms with satisfaction. "This will make an excellent Chronicle headline." Lovejoy glanced at Purbright. "Well, sir," Purbright stepped down from the stage, "I believe Mr. Hardwick's final lesson has been delivered. Outside, The evening air had settled quietly over Market Square. The town hall lights glowed warmly through the windows, and the people of Flaxborough were already discussing the peculiar generosity of the late Ambrose Hardwick. Inspector Perbrite walked slowly across the square toward the police station. Sergeant Lovejoy followed. "You know," Lovejoy said thoughtfully, "for a man who disliked the town so much, Hardwick certainly left it a memorable story." Perbrite smiled faintly. "Yes." "And a theatre?" "Yes." Lovejoy shook his head. "Very awkward bequest." Perbrite nodded. "Quite.